Well, we'll get started, everyone. Hello, and welcome to EcoEngineers' presentation of Exploring CI Scores for RNG Facilities. My name is Kathy Macbeth, and I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing for EcoEngineers. Thank you for joining us from all of your maybe over 400 remote locations. We hope you are all well and that we can deliver some value to you over the next 60 minutes or so with today's presentation. EcoEngineers is a renewable energy consulting firm specializing in clean energy regulations and working with biofuel producers across all fuel types to build out a clean energy economy. Our 360 approach to RNG allows us to work alongside you from project concept to commissioning, and our performance to date on our 360 EcoEngineers biogas RNG solutions includes more than 70 preliminary carbon intensity evaluations, consultation on more than 100 RNG projects since 2016, verification of over 75 RNG projects in federal and state clean energy regulations, over 150 LCFS pathways submitted, support of asset optimization on over 1 billion in RNG asset investments, on all types of projects that include landfills, anaerobic digestion, wastewater treatment plants, industrial, agricultural residue, both into traditional and voluntary carbon markets. Let me present our presenters today. Let me introduce our presenters today. Brad Plima is joining us and he'll lead the presentation. Brad's a senior engineer with EcoEngineers and our RNG line of business manager. Natasha Bielstein, who's a senior regulatory consultant with EcoEngineers and a CARB accredited lead verifier, and Dr. Zhizhao Wang, who is also a senior engineer, carbon analyst, and also an accredited lead verifier. Our agenda that we're going to cover today includes carbon basics, carbon intensity basics, typical CI scores for RNG feedstock projects, manure-based projects, and what we've learned that's important there, and an overview of LCFS validation and annual verification requirements, and also opportunities for RNG and hydrogen and electricity production. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Brad. Brad?
Thanks, Kathy, and we'll echo what Kathy said. Appreciate everyone jumping on a webinar. I'm sure, like many of you, we're all doing this remotely from home, and so if we miss a little bit of handoffs, bear with us, and we'll try to make this as smooth as possible. But we've done several similar webinars in the past, and one of those has been about LCFS basics of the program. And so for this model, or for this version, we're hoping to have a more 201 level of discussion around carbon intensity scoring for RNG projects. So we'll give a little bit of background about the GREET model itself, what life cycle analysis is, and then we want to spend a good chunk of time going through the various carbon intensity or CI scores for different types of RNG projects. We'll break down a preliminary CI score for a dairy manure project. We'll also do an example of a municipal wastewater treatment plant. And then I'm going to hand it over to Natasha. We'll talk about the verification and validation, which is a new requirement for the program that began this year in 2020. And then she's going to finish off talking about some innovative ways that people are using or thinking about using RNG in other renewable fuel types. And then we'll try to save a good 15 or 20 minutes for question and answer. So with that, what is the GREET model? And that really is the acronym is greenhouse gas regulated emissions and energy use in transportation. And it's a model that was produced by Argonne National Labs, and currently CARB, California Air Resources Board, is on the third version. So you'll hear the term GREET 3.0 very frequently, and that is the current modeling program that is recognized by CARB for LCFS pathways. And really what the goal of a GREET model is to evaluate the life cycle emissions of a transportation fuel, starting at the very beginning of a feedstock, transport, processing, production of the fuels, and the end use and combustion, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. But it does cover any transportation fuels, so other ethanol, biodiesel, RNG, renewable diesel. Everyone uses the same concept and the same GREET model base. It's updated annually from Argonne Labs, although CARB usually publishes a new version about every 3 years or so. And another thing with the unit is oftentimes people will refer to their CI score as unitless. So they'll say, I'm minus 200 or I'm plus 40. But really, there is a unit associated with that. It's grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And so you'll see those terms throughout this presentation. Just wanted to give a basic background of what the model is and what it looks for. So what are the key components of this GREET model and the LCA? Well, as I mentioned, this is a full life cycle analysis. So you want to have to model how was the feedstock produced, how was it collected, how was it transported, how was it processed, what are the fuel yields from the production of that feedstock, co-products, what are the uses, how is that biogas refined and upgraded, injected and transported all the way from the production facility to use as CNG or LNG in California, and ultimately how it's actually combusted in a transportation vehicle. And then also there are some land use considerations that go into the model. We'll talk about a little bit later about how CARB has tried to simplify some of these key feedstocks to make all of those components. If you're modeling every single component, that can be quite lengthy and quite detailed. So we'll talk a little bit more here shortly about some simplified calculators in order to do that. Next, wanted to move on towards, this is the carbon intensity values of certified pathways. It's a little bit older, a couple of months old, but this is actually published by CARB and available on their website by fuel type. And so you can see we've highlighted the 3 primary biogas or RNG pathways. Electricity, there's a handful of pathways that are available for RNG to electricity. Bio LNG and bio CNG, which we'll talk much more about those two later. But you can see the wide range of potential carbon intensity scores for these RNG biogas type facilities when you compare it with others. So for example, if you look at the renewable diesel category, a couple lines below the yellow CNG, bio CNG line, you'll notice that most of those are between 10 and 60 scores, a lot of facilities in that range. Well, on the bio CNG, anywhere from negative 400 all the way up to positive 65, positive 70. So a wide range of potential CI scores based on the type of RNG project and the feedstock that is used to generate the CNG as transportation fuel. We'll talk about what those ranges look like and why it's important to model your project as correctly as possible, because there is such a wide potential variation in the carbon intensity score. Moving on, what are some potential CI score ranges for RNG projects? We tried to list some common ranges. As Kathy mentioned, I believe we've now modeled over 100 RNG facilities, whether in preliminary form or in official applications to CARB. And so these are just some typical ranges that we see. There could be outliers for specific reasons on the variations of this, but in general, these are common ranges that we see. So landfills typically have a positive CI score of 30 to 60, wastewater treatment plants 20 to 50, organic food waste negative 60 to 50. So that's a good one to talk about. Why a bigger range? Why can food waste or organics have a negative carbon intensity score? And it's really towards the bottom of the slide there, landfill diverted organics can qualify for avoided methane emission credit. So I think everyone here is likely familiar that dairy and swine manures can qualify for these avoided methane emission credits and make these projects highly negative. Landfill diverted organics can also qualify for that, but typically not at that. They won't score as negative as the manure-based projects, but certainly can be in the -50, -60 range for the landfill diverted organics. Dairy manure, which is really the trend, the hot topic within the RNG LCFS space, uh, ranging from commonly -100 to -300, although we'll talk more specifically a little bit later on of why projects could fall outside of that range for the good or for the worse on the CI score. Swine manure in a similar, although -100 to -200, although again, those swine manure projects can go higher, better than -200, but that's the common range that we've seen. And wanted to point out here beef cattle manure, which would also be applicable to other manures, turkey litter, chicken litter. Notice that there's a positive CI score range there. And that's really because in the regulation, the avoided methane emissions credits are only for dairy and swine specifically. So beef cattle, even if it's confined beef cattle that uses an open lagoon, currently based on CARB's information from CARB, that beef cattle manure will not qualify for methane avoidance credit. Although there is a push within the industry to try and change that, as manure going into an open lagoon still emits methane. So we'll see. There's some rulemaking processes that are ongoing with CARB that a lot of the industry is hopeful some of these other manures may get included in that. But for now, only dairy, swine, and landfill diverted organics, in a general sense, can qualify for avoided methane emissions credits and have that low CI number. You can see on the right-hand side why that's important and why everyone is looking at dairy with the overall values of these credits. So what is the importance of these CI score ranges, and what does that mean for a project? Well, the facility's carbon intensity score determines how much revenue you're going to generate from these projects. So you can see on the table on the right, we varied what is the per MMBTU value of LCF of a project with a certain carbon intensity score, assuming a $200 per metric ton credit value. And that equals about $2.10 per MMBTU for every 10 CI points up or down. We've also seen, because I mentioned earlier, the importance of getting the modeling as correct as possible, we've seen several mistakes in models or people trying to do modeling without a high level of experience and making some wrong assumptions in the model. But a common one is just assuming that you have a certain feedstock, that your project will fall in right inside or right alongside of some of the others. So a common one we've seen is, well, I have dairy manure. There's several dairy manure projects registered in that -250 CI score range. That means my project will be -250, right? And they may run and do project due diligence. They may tie up feedstocks. But really, you need to model that farm baseline as early as possible to understand what the carbon intensity score is. We've modeled a positive CI score dairy projects because of that methane avoidance credit that we talked about before. To really get the full value of that, the baseline manure management practice needs to be an open lagoon that is not cleaned out very often, that is not agitated and mixed very often. So for dairy projects that don't use a lagoon for primary treatment, maybe they separate solids coming out of the barn and then they land apply on a more continuous basis. Well, there's no anaerobic digestion or very minimal happening when you land apply those solids compared to sending them to a lagoon and letting the anaerobic digestion process happen in the lagoon. So you can see positive CI score dairy projects when there's no lagoon possible. We've also seen some projects that score in the -50 to -100 range because the solids, which is where most of the energy content is contained, they do solid separation before it goes to the lagoon. So if you think about what projects and what dairies score the best, it's open lagoons as the basis of treatment, and then as much of the solids that go to those lagoons as possible. And then they're not cleaned out very often. Those are going to score very high up. Other variations you really need to model, and we really recommend some experienced third-party modeling to do that, because there are a lot of nuances with these projects. So I wanted to talk here just as a, what is the application? What are the different tier types? So CARB has, with the readoption of the rules, there's a tier 1 pathway and a tier 2 pathway application, or a lookup table. But you'll notice in the RNG space, biomethane, almost everything falls into the tier 1 or tier 2. So CARB tried to simplify the modeling and the application process with these tier 1 pathways. And you'll note that biomethane from landfills, anaerobic digestion of wastewater, so municipal wastewater treatment, organic waste, dairy, and swine, they all have a tier 1 pathway possibility. And then tier 2 is more reserved for innovative and unique projects, unique fuel types, or innovative processes. One thing that does fall into a tier 2 category is if you're considering trucking RNG to the pipeline injection, or if you're considering using on-site power generation. So any on-site solar, any on-site CHP, or if you use propane in your process to maybe boost the BTU content on the back end, if you use propane to start and use for the thermal oxidizer or the flare, that will actually fall into a tier 2 pathway process, but you may just use a slight variation of a tier 1 simplified calculator. So wanted to spend just a few minutes here talking about these simplified calculators and what they look like. So we have, there's several, these are all downloadable on the CARB's website, and you can see the list there, and notably from the CNG, LNG, landfills, dairy or wastewater, biogas from wastewater treatment plants, dairy and swine. You can go download those and play around with those in a simplified version. And really what the goal with these simplified calculators is to limit the number of inputs and to limit the number of variables to make it easier for the producer to calculate the carbon intensity score. Now, because of that, your project may not get the full value if you're doing something slightly different on one of those levers where CARB uses an assumption compared to your project specific details. But it's difficult to change that if you are doing something very unique and very different. That's what the tier 2 process is for, that you can provide extra information, use a tier 2 model or a modified tier 1 simplified model, and show CARB, demonstrate that to them with data why your project is different. So these calculators are readily available and available for anyone to go down there and download and use. So next I wanted to talk about what are some considerations for calculating. We're going to get into a project example here of dairy RNG. And so, like I mentioned earlier, we need to take into account the entire life cycle of this process. So what type of feedstock, what are the baseline manure management conditions that we mentioned earlier? How much process energy does it take to generate the biogas, to upgrade and clean the biogas and inject it into the grid? And then an important component is fuel yield. So how efficiently and how much RNG are you making compared to that herd size in this example? And then also, how are you getting it to the pipeline? Are you doing a direct pipeline injection? Are you trucking RNG? That will have a CI impact. And then also, how far of the distance from California you are. In the CI model, it's approximately 6 CI points for every 1,000 miles from California. So 2 identical projects, one in California, that number would be closer to 0. Or if you have a New York-based project that's 3,000 miles away, even though all the other parameters may be the same, that would be about an 18-point difference in the overall carbon intensity scores. And a lot of that has to do with just the sheer pipeline distance from New York to California. There are some assumed losses in that calculator that makes these numbers that makes them different. So on the right-hand side, we just wanted to walk through what is an example for it. This is using the simplified tier 1 calculator process. And you can see there's a lot of things to get correct, but there's also a lot of fixed components that you don't have control over. So obviously you can see the grid electricity is a big one. How much natural gas was used in, how much biogas or to produce the biogas and to compress the biogas to pipeline quality. How much is flaring impacted? We have fugitive emissions. So can you account for the methane throughout the process, basically a methane mass balance? There's that transmission distance, which is just sheer distance from California. And then we have some compression. This would be at the CNG station level. We have the tailpipe emissions. What are the estimated CI impacts of combusting this as a transportation fuel in these heavy-duty vehicles? And then we have the big avoided emissions credits that we talked about before. So all of those will add up and equal a number. And you can see that negative 316 score for the avoided emissions credits is huge. That's the biggest driver for these projects. So a lot of times people will ask us, well, if I use 10% less electricity, is that good for my CI score? And it is, definitely it is. But if you look at that grid electricity, that's only 10 points of a scoring impact. If you take 10% or 20% of that, we're only talking a few points one way or the other. So while it is a component of these, the key major components are getting these avoided emissions methane numbers and the baseline correct, which is what we're going to talk about next year. So what does that baseline look like, and how does that compare to a project? There we go. So as I mentioned, the current manure management practices are important. We also have how much of the volatile solids make it to the lagoon. As I mentioned before, we want the higher percentage that make it to the lagoon, the better. So for a dairy or a swine manure operation that is separating solids ahead of the lagoon, those will not score as well because some of that energy content is not making its way all the way to the lagoon. How often do you clean those lagoons out? Most of the time, this may be once a year or twice a year, but we'll show in the next slide of that can have a very significant impact of what that answer is. And that's not necessarily meaning if the current practice is to suck some of the liquids off to keep the lagoon from overflowing. When they talk about lagoon frequency cleanout, it's more of the solids. So are you agitating solids? Are you trying to rid that lagoon of the most amount of solids? That will score worse than a farm that leaves the manure and all the solids in the bottom of the lagoon for a longer period of time. Also, the other thing that's important is the biogas yield. As CARB basically gives a set amount of methane avoidance credits per head of cow. And so if your project generates more or less biogas per head of cow than CARB's assumption and CARB's cow, your CI score will be impacted. So it's actually reverse. It's a little counterintuitive. The more RNG you produce at a site, the worse your carbon intensity score will be for these dairy projects. And vice versa. The less you produce, the better your score will be. It's because essentially you're getting the same amount of those methane avoidance credits. And if you produce more RNG, those methane avoidance credits are being spread out amongst a larger volume. Where vice versa, if you're producing less than the amount, it has a concentrating effect. And so your score will improve. But the overall revenue impacts do not drastically change. The benefit of producing more RNG, even at a worse CI score, is that you'll get RINs all the way across that entire volume where you wouldn't. So if you look at a covered lagoon, for example, those do not typically produce as much RNG as a well-heated, well-mixed digester, especially in the northern climates like in Iowa where we're at. If you only produce gas for 6 or 8 months of the year, then when you compare that to a well-mixed anaerobic digester tank-based, you're going to produce quite a bit less, but you're going to see your CI score increase, be better fairly dramatically. And that's really because of those avoided emissions credits. So this is just a quick summary before I turn it over to Natasha here of what are some of these manure considerations on avoided methane. The type of manure matters, like we talked about. Dairy and swine get the methane avoidance credit along with landfill diverted materials. Beef cattle and other manures, unfortunately, currently they're excluded from those methane avoidance credits. What is the best baseline manure management practice? Lagoons are the best. No lagoons, it's going to be difficult to get those credits. On the hog side, we have been asked, and we've modeled several deep pit barns. So basically, they collect the hog manure underneath the barn and store it for 6 months or a year. There is still anaerobic digestion happening there. Those do get methane emissions credits. They typically do not score as well as open lagoons, but they do still can score negative, maybe in the -50 to -100 range for general project. As I mentioned, how much manure goes to the lagoon, 40 to 70 point impact can have on that volatile solids to the lagoon. How often are the lagoons cleaned? If somebody's cleaning out that lagoon quarterly compared to a farmer that never cleans out the lagoon and just sucks some liquids off the top, that could have a 100-point CI swing. So that's a big one. And then we talked about how much methane avoidance would happen for compared to RNG production volume. So those are the main characteristics for avoided methane. And just quickly, the same process here for a wastewater treatment plant in this example. Notice that there's less inputs, and there's only a handful of things that the user has a control of here. How much electricity, natural gas are you using to produce the biogas or to upgrade the biogas to pipeline quality? How much are you producing, and how far are you from California? A lot of other set and fixed values, as you see there in the example, in this hypothetical example that has a CI score of about 35 for this facility. What are some things you can do to lower CI? And this would apply to any of the feedstocks. You could install on-site solar. That does need to be behind the meter. So you cannot have a solar array and use the principle of displacement or book and claim. You actually have to have the solar farm on site with a direct connection to the facility. Same thing if you use on-site power generation. The more efficient you can produce your fuel, the better that will be for your overall carbon intensity score. And any way you can lower energy inputs will also input your score. So that's just a really quick, 20-minute or so overview of this, some common CI scores. We'll talk more in the Q&A session, but for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, I'm going to turn it over to Natasha to talk about how the new pathway validation and verification processes work. So take it away, Natasha.
Thanks, Brad. I love that idea of thinking about carbs cow and like how carbs, maybe they have just a bunch of cows sitting there and they're doing studies on them. That always cracks me up to think about it that way. Thanks everyone for tuning in to hear a little bit more about LCFS, the low carbon fuel standard, carbon intensity modeling. And I think it's hard to talk about carbon intensity modeling and the LCFS program right now in 2020 without talking about pathway validation and annual ongoing verification. The verification program is in its first year right now. So it became effective in January 2020, and it is mandatory for any LCFS program participant. So whether you are a renewable fuel producer, any of the regulated parties, credit generation, anyone who's a player in this program is they're mandated to have verification on an annual basis. Starting this year, though, anyone who is applying for a fuel pathway, so when you ask for your facility-specific carbon intensity, you will have to complete validation, which is what CARB was doing before, where they'd go through your pathway application, they would walk through your model, supporting documentation, and they would certify your pathway. Now, starting in 2020, the third-party verification bodies are going to be doing this. Part of this verification also implements this annual field pathway report. So part of the annual field pathway report will look a lot like your pathway application. And in order to verify these annual field pathway reports, we have a monitoring plan that must be completed. So anyone who's accountable for verification, so like I mentioned, field pathway holders, credit generators, deficit generators, all have to have a monitoring plan in place where there's a general overview of your facility, operations, how you're generating credits, how you're allocating credit generation between different field pathway codes, looking at measurement devices. Measurement devices are key in your monitoring plan because that will speak to the data accuracy that we're working with. These aren't generally submitted to CARB staff for approval, but our best practice recommendation is that you have it ready because they can ask for it. Say, for example, they are working towards reviewing your pathway application and they have questions, they might ask for that. So initial validation, as I mentioned, is starting this year, and it is an independent review. So there will be an independent review of the GREET modeling that has taken place, and there will be a site visit that is mandatory. So that's a little bit different than what was happening previously because CARB staff wasn't coming on site to a lot of these facilities. Now you'll have a third-party verification body coming on site in order to certify your pathway. After that site visit is complete, after the desk audit is complete, a statement to certify the pathway will be given. Ongoing verification services will include the review of the field pathway report, like I mentioned, verification of the CI score component. So the field pathway report will walk through all of the data that is used to create the carbon intensities, looking at your process energy use, looking at your feedstock, looking at all of the inputs and all of the outputs to ensure the data accuracy. Any credit generation activities, looking at the fuel pathway codes that are used and how you're deciding the volumes that are associated with each one of those fuel pathway codes when you're generating credit. Then looking at the verification report. So that's something that the verification body will do, but it is the responsibility of the entity that is responsible for verification to review that report because it will be delivered to CARB staff. Again, there is a mandatory site visit requirement that happens on an annual basis. You might hear a little bit about this quarterly verification. Quarterly verification is essentially a quarterly data check within the context of annual verification. So you wouldn't be asked to do a fuel pathway report, but it is an optional quarterly data check. So for example, some of those projects where Brad mentioned with the ultra low CI, those you might be incentivized, I guess you could say, to look at the CI score on a quarterly basis because you want to make sure that you are operating at or below that CI score. Just to walk through some of these big landmarks that have led up to this point. So we have GREET 2.0 pathways. So there are some GREET 2.0 pathways that are still active, and those will expire at the end of 2020. We have the GREET 3.0 pathway application, and those started to be submitted in the beginning of 2019, and those are still being submitted until the next model, GREET 4.0, or whatever they decide to call it, until that is released. They have started a rulemaking for the next version of the regulation. It is obviously delayed given the current climate, but we do expect to see when there is a new rulemaking, a new model as well. So there will also then be given the time period to update to the next GREET model at that time. The monitoring plan, as you can see here, preparation up until 2020, but it is required to be in place starting in 2020. CARB validation, so that's when CARB was doing the certification of the pathway. They were reviewing the pathway, they were walking through all the items with you. Starting in 2020, it will be the verification body. And next slide, please. One important thing I'll mention here actually is that the first verification report is due August 31st, 2021. And that might be a little bit confusing to think about when we think about verifications starting in 2020. All that means is that we'll be verifying data from 2020 starting in 2021. So for example, the report that will be verified is due March 31st, 2021, but that's covering 2020 data and 2019 data if applicable. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about RNG for hydrogen and electricity production. Looking at some of the carbon intensity scores out there, looking at some of the incentives that are there for hydrogen and electricity, they become a really attractive fuel options. California actually, now that I'm thinking about it, is the first pathway for electric and hydrogen fuel into a state. So if we think about the federal program, the RFS, there's no electric or hydrogen pathway that has been passed. And that's largely because the state has figured out how to account for double counting when we think about electric and hydrogen pathways. However, in the federal program, the RFS, it works a little bit differently, and the way it's formatted makes it a little more difficult to account for that double counting. They're rapidly expanding the number of stations that are available in California, and there's even more funding to increase the number of stations that are available. I mean, 68,000 or so chargers, 44 dispensers of hydrogen, that's a really high number. So, and we only expect to see that grow more and more, especially as we start to think about low CI options for this. So California has carved out, the low carbon intensity electricity and renewable hydrogen. Low carbon intensity electricity comes from a low carbon intensity source. So for example, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about this ultra low electric pathway that was a dairy manure project where they created electricity out of it in California. That was a negative 630 or some type of CI like that. That's very, very low. That's not always the case, but that does bring a lot of attention to the fact that there are a lot of low carbon intensity electric options out there. As Brad mentioned on the lookup table pathways, you have zero CI options, you have a few different options where you wouldn't have that option, but for the ultra low electricity, you'd want to have a tier 2 pathway, just to refer back to the earlier section. So for low CI electricity, I know everyone saw that pathway and got really excited. The negative 600, how can I get that? First off, you have to be within the WEC region, which is this green part right here. It's a little more of a messy boundary, but generally speaking, it's these provinces and these states. Renewable natural gas does qualify. Wind and solar, those are zero CI projects, and those would be eligible for the lookup table pathway. But renewable natural gas would be a tier 2 pathway. If your project is within this area, this would be an option for you. You can't generate the other types of environmental attributes like you would under like a PPA or cap and trade. And unfortunately, at this time, there's no RFS RIN associated for this, but it is still an option. So I do think it is significant to remember that even though the RFS has not found a way forward for this, that it is still an option in the LCFS program. It is also notable that in talking about LCFS verification, electric fueling is not subject to verification requirements. The fuel pathway portion of it would be, where you are verifying the CI score for the tier 2 pathway. So for example, renewable natural gas to electricity. But the fueling that's associated with that for credit generation is not subject to verification. Renewable hydrogen is a little bit different because we can use book and claim biomethane from anywhere in the US to create renewable hydrogen. Under this newest version of the regulation, it is considered a specified source feedstock. So generally when we think about specified source feedstocks, we think to UCO, used cooking oil for biodiesel production. But a couple of other types of feedstocks qualify, and in this case, book and claim biomethane. The credit generation is based off of the amount that is dispensed for vehicle fueling. One important difference from the low CI electricity here is that renewable hydrogen is accountable to the same fueling requirements as RNG. So not only do you have to have your CI score validated and verified on an annual basis, any credit generation for your hydrogen pathway, your renewable hydrogen pathway, would have to be verified on an annual basis as well.
Thanks, Natasha. I think that was great. I had a question. You know, we've been building out our LCFS verification team here over the last basically year at EcoEngineers, and we're now starting to see, as this is the first implementation year, especially some of these low CI projects, of how will that actually be administered, and how are people going to track data and carbon intensity scores throughout the year. So when you get to do your fuel pathway report at the end of the year, like you said, is due March 31st, what happens if your pathway is, you know, say negative 200, but you gather all your data and your true carbon intensity score is say minus 190 or something like that?
Sure.
How do you see that happening, and what will be the impact to the producer if something like that would happen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, you know, there's some substantiality that goes into, you know, a negative 190 versus negative 200. You know, we have to look at the point amount difference. But I think the largest impact to the producer would be that the producer has to make the market whole. So if you were generating all of the credits between the CI score of 79.9 for natural gas to negative 200, and then you're actually operating at a negative 190, you would have to make that difference between the negative 200 and negative 190 whole. It is up to CARB really on how they would take that action, and I do hope they would work with producers on how that takes place. But that's what we see is probably the most likely course of action for CARB in that scenario.
And then similarly, what if your carbon intensity score is reversed? Like, what if you get to go back and retroactively generate credits, or do you automatically get that lower CI? So in that example, what if your real score was negative 205? What does that look like?
Sure. So I'd love to tell you get to generate all the credits between the negative 200 and negative 205. Unfortunately, that's not the case. However, you can operate under the negative 205 going forth. I know CARB will have some discussion with you to make sure that you truly will operate at that negative 205, and that it wasn't just, it wasn't just a temporary reduction of some sort. Maybe you were doing something different during those 12 months or 24 months that won't be carried forward. But you could use that CI score going forward. Unfortunately, not just not backwards.
Okay, great. Thanks, Natasha. What about questions? I think if people want to go ahead and type in some questions if they have specifically, or I've listed all of our contact information here. If you want to talk about your facility or have a really detailed question, you can go ahead and see what those look like. And I also wanted to introduce Dr. Zhizhao Wang, who is our senior engineer and our lead carbon analyst here at EcoEngineers. If you've done any CI work with us in the past, you've probably interacted with him, and he's a great resource. He has a hand in almost all of our models and our activities there. So he's also on the call to answer some questions if we have some. And let's see, Lindsay or Kathy, are you seeing any of the questions there? I'm not seeing any there.
There's actually quite a few questions in here. They've been trickling in as you guys have been talking. I don't even really know where to start.
Maybe just grab a couple of them and we'll see what we can do.
So how about we have what is the criteria for qualifying for D3 RINs?
D3 RINs, it's a set feedstock, so little bit different, different program under the RFS, but basically any landfills, waste biosolids from wastewater treatment plant processes, agricultural residues, all qualify for D3 RINs. And anything that has a cellulose content, adjusted cellulose content of 75% or greater would qualify for D3. Basically everything else, sugars, fats, oils, proteins, all those heavy materials would qualify for D5 RINs. Under the LCFS, that does bring up a good point. Under the LCFS, you know, co-digestion. So if you mix different feedstocks into the RFS, you may have some D3 qualification issues. But under the LCFS, they actually do allow for co-digestion. And CARB recently released some guidance, I think it was July of 2019, about how to handle co-digestion. So you can get a split. You basically model the various pathways and scores for the various feedstocks, and then take a conservative approach on how much RNG is produced from each. So that co-digestion isn't as big of an issue in that regard.
So similarly, what's a CI score range for co-digesting biosolids with high strength organic waste then? So how does the CI range for those?
Yeah, good question there. And so how that is approached is, so there's a little bit, it's not quite linear, but think of it this way: if you were processing only non-landfill diverted organics, let's say that had a CI score of positive 40, and you had 50% of your RNG came from landfill diverted organics at negative 40, you would basically have those two pathways. But in essence, if half of your gas came from each source, you would have that blended CI of 0 that from your revenue projection. So from a regulatory standpoint, you would have two pathways with different CI scores. But from a practical, like, revenue analysis standpoint, you can blend those based on what the projected RNG output volume is, and use that ratio.
Thanks, Brad. So how are these LCFS revenues tied to a specific state LCFS structure, or an example for California, Oregon, or Washington, who have different programs?
Sure. Natasha, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah. So I think what the question is asking, and let us know in the chat if I'm wrong, is how do you differentiate between the different CI scores for example, in this scenario, Oregon and California. There's different fuel pathway codes that are used for both states. So you will just need to ensure that you're using the correct fuel pathway code when you're generating credits or when you're doing any type of activity associated with your fuel pathway. In this scenario, you'll want to make sure that you're not double counting between the two, and during verification, this will be an item you likely need to specify, that you're not double counting between Oregon and California, that you are allocating the renewable natural gas appropriately.
What do we have is biochar produced by thermal processes from biogenic feedstock that is buried or used as soil amendment considered carbon sequestration, and how much would that impact CI score?
Yeah, that's a deep, detailed, in-depth one. Zhizhao, I don't know if you want to maybe talk just briefly about carbon sequestration, and we've done a lot of analysis on potential carbon sequestration activities, and I think maybe Zhizhao there may be best positioned to just speak generally about maybe that example and what that looks like.
Sure. In general, if the biochar carbon sequestration is allowed in the LCFS, it could make a significant impact. However, currently we don't have any pathways approved yet. We know a couple of producers are exploring these ideas with CARB, and a lot of discussion are happening with CARB staff. But at this point, there is no such pathway approved yet. So we'll see down the road whether one can get the carbon sequestration credit or not.
Good
Okay. Is there any discussion around RNG projects outside California being prevented from California markets as more come online?
I'm not aware of any discussions that have had that are allowing that. I think California, to meet the goals of the LCFS program, to meet that 20% overall reduction by 2030, they have to have out-of-state projects in order to generate enough credits in order to do this. So you never say never with regulators and changing of the rules, but I don't think that's been a hot topic of conversation because there's pathways, and we have clients in Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong that produce fuels there and ship them to California. And so it's really, California has made this more of a global market, not just the United States market, and opened it up to any renewable fuel producer that imports their fuels to California. So never say never, but I think that the likelihood and the chances of that are small, especially when you consider that, the program has been successful and is looking at what does the next level look like. Do we want to go to a 30% or a 40% reduction in future years? So I think if you look at the overall dynamics of the program, of how many credits are generated inside and outside of California, it's pretty massive how many are generated from facilities that produce and import their fuel.
Yeah, I was going to add in that, if you look at the approved pathway list and the number of RNG projects that are within California, just to be RNG specific, there's very few, and they're relatively small volumes. So a majority of the RNG in California is coming from out of state. And just because of that, I don't see that changing, at least in the next rulemaking. So yeah, I definitely echo what Brad says.
Here's one for you, Zhizhao. How long does a CI pathway score assessment take from start to finish?
That's a pretty complicated question to answer. It really depends on your specific project. Some ones are more complicated than the others. So in general, it could take anywhere from 30 days to maybe 120 days, I would say. That's a pretty wide range, but it really depends on the complexity of your project.
Yeah, I think too, Zhizhao, maybe what we could talk about, the process we've used is what we see is, you can't apply for a pathway. We didn't mention this, but I've talked about it in past webinars, but you can't apply for an LCFS pathway until the facility is built and you have 90 days, at least 90 days of operational data. And then you take that information and you submit that. But since the carbon intensity score is such a key component to revenue, and getting that number right or close in the feasibility stage is important. Certainly when you're going to get fund and securing funding to get a score. So Zhizhao and I do a lot of consulting with people that the facilities aren't built, but we'll model them using theoretical or design-based information. So I think we see that as a key tool and a common tool that if you do that early on in your process, and like I mentioned earlier, even if you get in the ballpark of how much process energy you're going to use to produce the fuel, we can typically get a carbon intensity score estimate in a pretty tight range with some good solid design-based data. And then, so that will give your preliminary, design-based score, and then you can use that to project revenues. You can use that to make decisions of, does it make sense to install on-site solar? How much additional revenue would I generate? What would the CI score impact of my project be by putting on-site solar into my project, and you can use that model and use that information to help you make business decisions that would be best served for your project. You can calculate a payback. You'll know how much additional revenue that solar will be, at least in a modeled case. And then when you go build it, you have a head start on constructing that model. If you're a complicated manure project, you really want to get that baseline established as early as possible, because you don't want a surprise of you've spent 6 months or 12 months developing a project, and then you go do your modeling and you realize your score wasn't negative 250 or wasn't as good as you thought it would be. So we really say and advocate for doing that preliminary modeling sooner rather than later, because that you can use that model and that data a lot of different ways as you go developing and designing your projects.
I'd also add in that there is a timeline that the pathway has to be certified within 6 months of submission. So I think that all verification bodies are cognizant of that. CARB, in our experience, has tried to be cognizant of that. So just know that there is some type of a deadline in the regulation as well.
I have a question here about hydrogen. It says, can you, sorry, did you have something else, Brad?
No, go ahead, Lindsay.
It says, can you expand on the 3 allowed methods of producing renewable hydrogen, specifically on the differences between the methods and typical CI?
Yeah, sure. I can't. It's a little bit hard to speak to specific CI for me. Zhao, do you have any feedback on that? Or that's probably something to talk about more on a case-by-case basis, right?
Oh, I think
you're muted.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I think the general ways for hydrogen production includes electrolysis using electricity and water. From RNG, it's mainly SMR. So the hydrogen CI is closely related to your feedstock, of course, whether you are using fossil-based natural gas or RNG of different CI. So depending on your CI of the RNG, your hydrogen will be different. So it's really hard to generalize a number of range for hydrogen. So we can definitely evaluate on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I know we're coming up against the hour that we had, and there's still, we'd be happy to hang out for a little bit longer and answer a few questions. But I think as part of this, Lindsay will be distributing the recording of this, and we'll also download the chat log and try to reach out to some of you individually with more specific questions. I know we didn't get to too many of them, but happy to have more of a discussion. And then there'll also be a survey with some feedback of I think we're all looking at what are some potential other topics. We're all looking for content, and we're all looking to interact with each other. So we've kicked around some different ideas here of maybe we just have an open dialogue and open it up to maybe a smaller group. But what are some of the other topics that you're looking at or you'd like to hear more of? We're open for ideas, and we're looking to help smooth out and pass some of this quarantine time as well. So with that, if everyone can jump off there if they'd like, but we'll stick around and maybe just answer a couple more questions there. But appreciate everyone's time in listening. We had a lot of people join and a lot of people subscribe to this, so appreciate that. Stay safe and stay healthy out there.
Want me to read off a couple more?
Yeah, maybe a couple more as we'll see if
people
want to hang out.
Yeah, this one is pretty timely. It says, are there any examples yet of delays to CARB CI score approvals due to COVID-19? And do you foresee there to be an issue for the remainder of 2020?
Yeah, Natasha, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so I think the biggest barrier here, well, there's a few, of course. So being in California, they've had shelter in place for quite some time. And there's limited access to, the AFP where pathway applications are submitted. So the way that the applications for review are even being distributed is slower. Then we walk into this new validation program, first quarter, second quarter of the implementation, and we have this big barrier of people can't travel, auditors can't travel to be on site. So I know that we are fighting to try and get some type of a virtual site visit implemented and allowed by CARB staff. How that works out, I hope it does. You know, I would hate for something like this to stop the movement that I think, the really good movement that has been happening on the pathway approval side with this new implementation of validation.
Hey, Natasha, I thought I'd just jump in on this one because you're probably not aware of it yet, but last night CARB did approve our virtual site visit protocols. So we are reaching out to a lot of our clients and scheduling virtual site visits as soon as today. But it will be, CARB will approve the virtual site visits on a case-by-case basis. So there's a breaking update from EcoEngineers.
Perfect. Well, there you go. Virtual site visits are happening, and they'll get your pathway certified.
Mm-hmm.
Case by case basis, right?
That's right.
Case by case.
CARB's, I like CARB's common answer, which is case by case basis.
Mm-hmm.
I had one in here. Oh, do we have any updates on the Oregon program, when that's going to launch and what's going on with that?
Yeah, last I've heard was that they were hoping to have a year delay from the implementation of the California program. I know late last year there was this push to have it after Q1. We're going to be right on track with California. I think they saw the implementation taking a lot of time, it being really human capital taxing. So they have decided to move it back a year. I don't know the impact of COVID-19 on that implementation, but I would note that the verification program that they're implementing will be both for their clean fuels program and their cap and trade program equivalent.
And yeah, just to clarify, that's the verification component. The actual program is up and running and has been for several years, but that implementation of verification is maybe a little bit delayed or a little bit behind.
Yes, actually, I'd say Oregon's thriving right now as far as, well, they were thriving as far as like credit prices, you know, 160 or so dollars a credit.
Yeah, definitely a nice climb for Oregon-based projects, or placing RNG into Oregon. Maybe one more, and then we can call it a day, and everyone can get back to.
Sure. Here's one. It says, how long do the initial CI scores last, and are they reassessed and changed over time? How often do you have to keep assessing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the annual verification will be a look back of your past 24 months or whatever available months you have of data. And so your score, when you put your fuel pathway report, you're going to notice that it's never going to match up, you know, to the 10th or the 100th of a point. And so you're really doing an annual look at your CI score, where in previous versions of the regulation, you basically had the same score as long as you didn't make a material change, process change to your plan. So it's more of an ongoing rolling 24-month CI score that will be assessed through the verification process once a year. And then if you do have a change, like let's just say your certified pathway score is -200 or negative 200, but you're trending better, things are going well, and you're noticing as you're tracking the data, your score is more like -220. You could go ahead and submit a pathway application amendment, providing you have the 90 days of data, providing you go through the pathway validation process again. You can get that lower CI score certified as long as you have the required components in place. So it can be it's an ongoing review, but if you do something different or make major changes, then you'll have to reassess and reapply for a new CI score for your pathway.
Okay, we're going to call that a wrap, Brad?
I think so. That's good. Appreciate everyone joining there. But yeah,
Thank
you have
you,
any last words, Kathy?
I'm sorry? The last
Do
word?
you have any last words, or
Yeah.
what maybe some overall what people have what you've seen out there of any slowdowns? The last word before we call it a day.
Here at EcoEngineers, we're not seeing any slowdown in the RNG space. I mean, we certainly see that ethanol is having their own struggles in the marketplace because it's so closely tied to the petroleum or gasoline market. Biodiesel seems to be holding its own, and RNG just continues to have some strong presence in the marketplace. So we're not seeing any slowdown of activity here. Projects are moving forward, and now that we've got the virtual site visits approved by both US EPA for RFS and LCFS, we can keep credit generation happening and these projects funded. So we're expecting a good year in RNG in 2020 at EcoEngineers. Great job, everyone. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Everyone.
See everybody later.
Joining us. Bye-bye.